Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to this channel. My name is Patrick and I have a question. When we look at African countries, most of them have got their independence some 50 years down the road. After this independence, we have seen that Africans remain the way they are in terms of infrastructure, standards of living, and their economy. Most African countries are under third world developed, I mean. So, I would like to know, why has Africa refused to develop?
My name is Fred Kwiringira Ruhamya. I'm a political analyst and a researcher. One of the hindrances or one of the challenges of Africa under development, security, poverty, it is caused by bad and poor leadership. Africa has immense potential in terms of resources, good soils, wildlife, minerals, and hardworking people. But one of the challenges in Africa is leadership question. What kind of leaders does Africa have? Much of Africa, or almost 3/4 of it, Africa has been independent for 50 years. When we got independence in most of the African countries, the hopes, the expectations of the populations at that time and the leaders, the hopes were so high, but they were extinguished. And part of it was because, of course, of the interference of the imperialists or the colonialists. There were good leaders like Patrice Lumumba in Congo, like Julius Kambarage Nyerere in Tanzania, like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and the one of Egypt and other few countries. But what happened was that some of these African leaders eventually became dictatorial, and it caused insecurity and caused wars. So the expectations of the independence and the hopes that when the Bazungu leave or when the whites leave, Africa would transform, we went backwards because of insecurity, because of bad leaders or dictators, but also because of the interference of the Europeans in some of the countries. Because whereas we got independence, there are some parts like in West Africa and other parts where the Bazungu remained an integral part of the processes and they would interfere. And that led to assassinations of so many African leaders few years after independence. Elsewhere there were wars that were caused by tribalism, at times caused by fight over resources, the misunderstandings of some religions. So Africa mainly has remained behind, because we can no longer keep talking about now the Europeans or the Bazungu after 50 years. I think much of Africa now, we should own or carry our own babies. Much of Africa is underdeveloped or has problems because of bad rulers and selfish leaders who are corrupt and dictatorial. They don't respect institutions. They don't follow the constitutions. They have not learned from the mistakes of the past, and they keep repeating the same mistakes. Because the few countries that have followed the constitutions, that have followed the norms and values of society, like in Tanzania, because of the culture that Mzee Mwalimu Nyerere, a statesman, established in Tanzania. Tanzania is now a stable country and it's on the right path. Botswana is now on the right path. Ghana, although the economy has challenges, which was the first country to get independence during Kwame Nkrumah's Osugafe's time in 1957. Ghana is now on the right path. It's just a question of fixing the economy. So there is a possibility. Seychelles is now stable, Mauritius. So it means that Africa can develop, can transform, as long as we have clean leaders who are not corrupt, who follow constitutions, who desire to see Africa change. You find some of the African leaders picking resources from Africa and keeping their monies, stolen monies, in France, in Belgium, in New York. And Africa does not, in Africa there are no basics. There is no clean water, there is no quality education, there is no proper infrastructure. The roads are, they are in a mess. So, given the resources that Africa has, the water bodies, wildlife, the national parks, the Arboretum, Africa, there has been a research. Africa can feed the whole world. If we had clean leaders, if we had focused leaders. But at times you find people are voting leaders who don't care about the people, who don't care about the country. They have streets in New York, in California, in Dubai, and yet their countries, they are in the third world. The majority of the people, half of the population in some of the African countries, can't meet basics. We still have children who don't go to school. The crisis of Africa, or Africa's problem, is a problem of leadership. It's a question of leadership. It will require the consciousness of the people, the awareness of the people, to understand and vote leaders that will address all that are concerned about the challenges of the time. Africa, in terms of resources, is the richest part of the world. And yet, it is the center. It's the umbilical cord of poverty. Why poor leadership? Why corruption? Why high debt burden? Why our resources are exploited and taken at chicken feed? Why should oil from African countries be bought at low prices? Why should Congo, after 60 years of independence, after 50 years of independence, be still run by Bazungu? And now we have now new imperialists in Africa who are also, plundering other African countries. Congo is now divided among militias and bodies from Europeans, but also from some African countries. What will it require for Congo, which is one of the richest countries in the world, to be stable, to develop? It will require a clear, visionary leader with a mind that is conscious of his people's problems. Look at the leadership in Congo. They tell you they have elections, but now what can elections in Congo bring when much of 3/4 of the country is inaccessible? Insecurity is part and parcel of life in Africa. Why are there refugees in Africa? We are brothers, we are one. Why do we, in Uganda here, we have refugees from Sudan, we have refugees from Rwanda, we have refugees from Congo, I think few from Kenya, Somalia. Why? Africa is big enough. Congo is big than even what can make their own people who are refugees live a better life. But they are refugees in Uganda for more than 30 years. There are some in Rwanda who are refugees. Rwanda now is stable. Why can't they answer the leadership question? Why are there some people running away? Why can't they listen to their concerns? Why do they fear their country and they feel safe in refugee camps in Uganda? Why can't they go back to their country? Why can't the leaders sit? Why can't their parliaments in Africa, in Nigeria, in Congo, in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Kenya? The other time, there was almost an overthrow of government in Kenya. just because there's an arrogant leader who is very corrupt, who is very, arrogant. He can't listen to the concerns of the youth, and they are over 70% in most of West African countries. There was almost revolutions everywhere. Younger people took over. There was a dictator in Egypt and Sudan. There was an overthrow of government just because of bad leaders. You have leaders who want to rule forever, eternal, chronicle. You wonder if a leader. Why do you think in America and some of the developed world you cannot serve more than 2 terms? Because they know that after 8-10 years, you have made your contribution. You should build institutions. You should establish ministries. You should establish institutions that are able to propel development. Because it's not about you, the individual. You are not Jesus. Even Jesus had disciples. So unless Africans rise up and demand accountability from their leaders, unless Africans start voting leaders, clean leaders, who promote unity, who care about service delivery, why should, today in the 21st century, why should we be still having countries, including Uganda, where we are today, where electricity or power coverage is 16% of the whole country? Half of the country doesn't have clean water. And you have leaders who have convoys, who are driving cars of more than $50,000, and they're saying, we are a poor country. We are a poor country with big parliaments, with big cabinets. Why should we have more than 25 ministers? You have almost 100 ministers, 80 ministers in most of these African countries. And yet in the developed world, you'll find there are only 20 secretaries. The parliament is small or it's big depending on the population. So why should Africa be spending money on administrative costs which are not necessary instead of service delivery? So one of the things that should be answered is that we should have leaders who care about the people. But that also will depend on the population. How do we make the population in Africa aware of their rights and responsibilities? How do we make sure that we vote people, the right people in the right places? You will find you have local leaders, you have leaders at regional level, you have leaders at national level. There are so many layers of leaders. Do we need them? And that's across Africa. And some of the things that we picked from Europeans should be now changed. We should make constitutions and laws and rules that govern our people according to the challenges of our time. The challenges of last generation, or the challenges of 100 years ago, a century ago, 1900, or 1962, or 1960s, when the Europeans left Africa, indirectly, but somehow they remained, because they remained with influence in most of the African countries. Those things should change. You cannot say, this is what happens in Britain. This is not Britain. The behaviors, the cultures, the norms, the values, the institutions, the systems in those developed countries have reached somewhere. But in countries, in African countries, where you find people are still debating about clans, about tribes, about regions, about religion, it's high time that we need leaders that have a vision. And that's how Africa will change. Africa will not change because of Europeans, because of Indians or Chinese. It will be because of Africa.
My second question is, why is it so difficult for Africans to travel amongst themselves in the African countries without limit? For instance, when I live here in Uganda and I cross to Congo, you cannot move a long distance without serious policy put by your side, and serious restrictions are needed. So I don't know why in Africa it is so difficult for people to move from countries to countries. whether you have a clear document, still you are restricted so much. Why do you think it is so much in those countries like that? How are we going to tackle them? I will also need you to look for us into the solution. Are there really solutions to help and implement these things settle or not?
I will go back to leadership. It's because of idle and shallow kind of leaders or systems or rules or laws that Africa still has those encumbrances or hindrances and free travel and free trade. Africa is one. Africa is supposed to be based on Ubuntu. Abantu. We are one. We are brothers. Most of the African people are one. Even in the languages, they are just regions, different, north, central, east, but much of African systems are shared. It was mainly divided by the Europeans, the partition. But somehow the African leaders have made it worse by creating small, platoons, small mountains, they call countries, and they make it difficult to have free trade with our brothers, with our sisters. You will find someone, it's easier for someone to travel from here to America, or Switzerland, or Dubai, but it becomes difficult to go to Congo, which is the next country, just because of insecurity, because of poor leadership, because of stupidity, because of shallowness, because of suspicion by our incompetent leaders. Because how come somebody is free from America to come and start moving between Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Congo, Uganda, and he's from Britain, he's from France, he's from Belgium? But you find it difficult for someone to come from here to Tanzania and move free from Uganda. You go to Congo, which is less than 100 kilometers from my home in southeastern Uganda, in Kisoro. You find that it's easier for me to go to Kenya, in Nairobi or Kisumu or any other part, which is 1,000 kilometers, than Congo, in Goma, which is 100 kilometers from Kisoro. And it's because of those boundaries, artificial boundaries that have been put there by shallow leaders, by corruption. Because at times you find you are hindered, like in Sudan, parts of South Sudan. Everywhere you will find a roadblock. And you can only move by paying bribes. In Tanzania, there are parts where people feel that, they are Tanzanians, they fear Kenyans, they fear Ugandans. It's as if you are going to grab their things, and it has hindered regional bodies. The East African Community, there has been a song. After its collapse in 1977, it's now over 20 years since their introduction. And flowery speeches by our president, Mr. Museveni, by Mzee Arap Moi, by I think Kikwete Mwinyi that time in Tanzania, Mkapa, whoever it was, and then now Kagame in Rwanda, and now Sudan, South Sudan is part of it. But what has happened? What did happen to we have East African members of parliament, but how comes we have ECOWAS, we have African Union. African Union has become a speaking club. How do you explain that we have African Union, but Libya collapses, Sudan collapses, Congo collapses, Burundi collapses, and there is insecurity in Congo now? What the solutions have the regional bodies thought? What are the solutions at African Union? In 1963, the vision of Organization of African Unity was clear. How many years now? Eventually, African Union, which Colonel Gaddafi was passionate about. It's unfortunate he died. But whereas he had done so much in Libya and he loved Africa, one of the challenges was his overstay in power. 42 years in power, and you still want to remain there as if you're a god, a small god. And we have also such African leaders. You are a president for 25 years, quarter of a century, 40 years, 50 years. It's part of the problem, because now you can no longer, because the other countries cannot trust you. And so some of these leaders, some of these shallow leaders, some of these selfish leaders make it even worse. But also the neo-colonialists, the developed world does not want Africa to open up. Because they know if we work together, if we are 1.2 billion and we start trading together, we start sharing our resources, we start sharing our knowledge, we start sharing institutions, it will undermine the benefits that the whites, the imperialists, the colonialists, and neo-colonists get from Africa. So the solution lies in African leaders and parliaments and institutions and other bodies that are responsible for making policies and laws and rules in each country to compare what America did, what European did, European Union, and these other international bodies. Because what kind of leaders do we have that they cannot even copy? That if these regional bodies, or if these European countries, or developed world can do this, and they work together entirely, if India can do this, and it becomes a dominant body in the world, if Putin has been able to transform Russia in a short time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, why can't Africans run? Why can't Africans run? Because the world is changing so fast. And unless Africans become conscious of the challenges of our time, 70% of the youth in Africa, it might be happening in other parts of the world, but many in Africa are unemployed, or are underemployed, or are in disguised employment. The poverty levels are very high, partly because our resources are not used optimally. We are not working together. We are not exploiting the synergies. Because why can't we work as a regional body and negotiate? Instead of Nigeria doing its own thing, making mistakes about oil for 40 years, Uganda repeats the same mistakes, Angola is making the same mistakes. Can't we run? Can't we run what Brazil has done about its coffee in order for us to benefit from coffee? Can't we have simple factories? What will require Africa or Africans to work together? We are brothers, we are one. We are based on Ubuntu. If Nyerere, just one man, was able to liberate more than 7 countries, including Uganda, including Rhodesia, including South Africa, and Kaunda, and other African leaders, why can't people, 40 years later on, 50 years later on, why can't our leaders copy? Instead, what they are doing, they are stealing and hiding resources in America, hiding resources in Britain. So, what is Africa? Why aren't Africans working together in trade, in travel? It's again because of that blindness, that closed mind, that stigma, the unfounded fear amongst our leaders. Because may I believe the people, because I've seen it across, especially people who live on borders, in parts of Uganda and Kenya and elsewhere. People trade amongst themselves, even when they stop them. They dodge revenue and still trade together. They intermarry. So it shows you that it's easy for Africans to work together. It's the leaders, it's the institutions, it's the parliaments to establish proper systems. It's the regional bodies, the East African Community, the African Union, to put a neighboring environment and the laws, enabling laws, and build strong armies, if that's required, or strong security systems, so that when you enter another country, you have a uniform or a kind of coordinated system of how they can check who you are. By now, in the 21st century, there should be a digitized system that every time they put the name Patrick anywhere, whether it's in Zimbabwe, whether it's in South Africa, all the information about you should be able to, should come. That's what others do. Fingerprints. That if you enter South Africa and they know that Patrick is from Uganda, he's either a businessman or a medical doctor or a politician, or a pilot, and they can tell that you don't have a criminal record. They can tell your age, so that it's easy for people to move. I don't see why it should be impossible for people to travel. I've been attempting to go to Botswana. There are hindrances. There are some African countries that are uncomfortable. In Ethiopia, at times they are not comfortable with some people from some countries entering Ethiopia. But to me, I want to go back to the leadership question. Why can't parliaments, these big parliaments in every country in Africa, put proper laws, put proper rules, put proper procedures on how we should trade together, on how we should travel from one country to another? Because it's just a question of doing security check. Africa is one. Africa is for brotherhood. Africa is for Ubuntu. It is possible for people to travel anywhere, trade with each other, study anywhere, work anywhere. It's a question of establishing proper rules, and proper leadership.